But this isn't just about one airline. Every company in this room can make the same commitment to change. Every one of you can implement comprehensive training programs that go beyond surface-level diversity initiatives. Every one of you can create systems that hold people accountable while also giving them the tools to do better. The speech received a standing ovation. Afterward, dozens of people approached Marcus to discuss implementing similar programs at their companies. He exchanged business cards, made connections, and felt hopeful that the conversation about discrimination and how to address it was truly beginning to change. One of the people who approached him after the speech was Sarah Mitchell. She had attended the conference as part of a panel discussion about learning from mistakes and becoming a change agent within your organization. Seeing her there, confident and articulate as she shared her story of transformation, Marcus felt proud of how far she'd come. "Mr. Williams," Sarah said when she reached him, "I just wanted to thank you once again for giving me a chance to learn and grow, instead of just punishing me for my mistakes. I'm now training new flight attendants on bias awareness, and I tell them all my story. I don't hide from what I did. I own it, and I use it to help others understand that we all have biases we need to work on." "I'm proud of you, Sarah," Marcus said sincerely. "You've turned a painful moment into an opportunity to help countless others. That takes real courage." As the conference concluded, Marcus reflected on everything that had happened since that day on the plane. What started as a hurtful experience of discrimination had transformed into a movement for change. The training program had expanded to multiple airlines and other industries. Thousands of employees had gone through the curriculum, learning to recognize their biases and commit to treating everyone with equal dignity and respect. But Marcus knew the work wasn't finished. Discrimination still existed in countless forms across society. Bias training was just one tool among many needed to create lasting change. There would be more incidents, more painful experiences, more moments when people had to decide whether to respond with anger or with a commitment to education. Yet when Marcus looked at what had been accomplished in just 6 months, the policies changed. The people trained, the conversations started, the awareness raised. He felt hopeful. Real change was possible. It required patience, commitment, and a willingness to have difficult conversations. But it was possible. His phone buzzed with a text from Robert Jefferson, the retired civil rights lawyer from the flight. "Just read about your speech at the conference. Wish I could have been there. You're doing important work, young man. Keep it up." Marcus smiled and replied, "Thank you for your encouragement. Couldn't have done it without the support of people like you." As he packed up his materials and prepared to head back to his office, Marcus thought about the future. The bias training program would continue to expand. More airlines would adopt it. Other industries would implement similar initiatives. Jessica's book would reach even more people. Sarah and others like her would train thousands of employees, spreading the message that change was both necessary and possible. One difficult experience on a flight had created ripples that were still spreading, touching lives and changing minds. And that, Marcus thought, was worth more than any first-class wine could ever be. Not just flight attendants, but also gate agents, customer service representatives, and corporate staff. It was a massive undertaking, and Marcus's foundation would be playing a central role. In the conference room, 5 airline executives stood as Marcus entered. He recognized the CEO, Michael Anderson, who stepped forward to shake his hand warmly. "Mr. Williams, thank you so much for making time for us today," Michael said. "I know you have a busy schedule." "Please, everyone sit down," Marcus said, gesturing to the chairs around the long table. "And call me Marcus. I think we're past formalities at this point." Michael smiled. "Then you must call me Michael. I want to start by saying again how sorry I am about what happened on that flight. As CEO, I take full responsibility for creating a company culture where that kind of discrimination could occur." "I appreciate that," Marcus said. "But what matters now is what we do moving forward. That's why we're here today." One of the other executives, a woman named Patricia who headed human resources, opened a folder in front of her. "We've been reviewing your foundation's bias training curriculum, and I have to say it's impressive. It goes far deeper than the standard diversity training most companies provide. It's not just about checking boxes, it's about real transformation." "That's the goal," Marcus agreed. "Most diversity training fails because it's superficial. People sit through a presentation, maybe watch a video, and then nothing in their daily behavior actually changes. Our program is designed to create lasting change through ongoing education, personal reflection, and accountability. David Chen, the venture capitalist from the flight, had also joined the meeting as an advisor. He had been working behind the scenes to connect Marcus with decision-makers at multiple airlines. "I've been speaking with my contacts at other carriers," David said, "and there's significant interest in implementing similar programs industry-wide. This could become a new standard for the entire aviation sector." Michael leaned forward, his expression serious. "We want to be the first airline to implement this fully. Not just because of what happened on that flight, but because it's the right thing to do. Our company serves millions of passengers from every background imaginable. We need to ensure that everyone who works for us understands how to treat all customers with equal respect and dignity." For the next 2 hours, they discussed the details of the program. They talked about timelines for training all existing employees, incorporating the curriculum into new employee onboarding, creating accountability measures to ensure people applied what they learned, and establishing a system for passengers to report concerns without fear of being dismissed or ignored. Marcus was impressed by how seriously the airline was taking this initiative. They weren't just trying to manage a public relations problem. They genuinely wanted to create lasting change. As the meeting was wrapping up, Patricia mentioned something that caught Marcus's attention. "We've also been in contact with Sarah Mitchell and James Rodriguez, the flight attendants from the incident. They've both been exemplary in their commitment to the training program. Sarah, in particular, has expressed interest in becoming a trainer herself once she completes the full curriculum." Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction hearing that. "That's wonderful. Having someone who has personally experienced the journey from unconscious bias to awareness and change, that makes her uniquely qualified to help others through the same process." "We thought so too," Patricia agreed. "With your permission, we'd like to feature her story in our training materials. Not to shame her, but to show that anyone can have biases they're not aware of, and that acknowledging and working on those biases is the path forward." "I think that's a great idea," Marcus said, "as long as Sarah is comfortable with it." After the meeting concluded and the executives left, David stayed behind to talk with Marcus privately. They walked back to Marcus's office together. "You know," David said, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened on that flight. I spoke up because I was angry, and I thought revealing your identity would make them take the situation seriously. But you taught me something important that day." "What's that?" Marcus asked. "That real change doesn't come from making people afraid of consequences," David explained. "It comes from helping them understand why their behavior was wrong and giving them the tools to do better. I've started applying that philosophy in my own business dealings. When companies in my portfolio fall short on diversity or inclusion, instead of just threatening to pull funding, I'm working with them to implement real solutions." Marcus felt gratified that his response to the incident was inspiring others to think differently about how to address discrimination. "That's exactly the kind of ripple effect I was hoping for. One incident leads to one conversation, which leads to policy changes, which leads to training programs, which leads to thousands of people learning to recognize their biases. That's how real change happens, not through one big dramatic moment, but through countless small moments building on each other." Over the following weeks, Marcus watched as the ripple effect continued to expand. The airline announced their new comprehensive bias training program in a press release that gained widespread attention. Other airlines began reaching out to Marcus's foundation to discuss similar initiatives. Corporate leaders from various industries contacted him to ask about implementing the training in their companies. Sarah Mitchell sent him regular updates on her progress through the training program. Her messages showed genuine transformation and deep reflection on her past behavior. She wrote about recognizing patterns she'd never seen before, about catching herself making assumptions and consciously correcting them, about feeling both ashamed of her past mistakes and hopeful about her ability to do better in the future. One message particularly stood out to Marcus. "Mr. Williams, I want to tell you about something that happened yesterday. I was working a flight and a young black woman boarded with a first-class ticket. My first instinct, and I'm ashamed to admit this, was to question whether she was in the right section. But then I caught myself. I recognized that automatic assumption, and I immediately shut it down. I greeted her with the same warmth and attention I would give any passenger, and I made sure she received exceptional service throughout the flight. Afterward, she thanked me and said it was one of the best flying experiences she'd ever had. I almost cried right there. This is what you gave me. The ability to recognize my biases and choose to act differently. Thank you for that gift. Marcus forwarded that message to Angela Porter with a note. This is why we do this work. Angela replied, Absolutely. And Sarah is going to help so many other people through this same transformation. She's one of our star students, the journalism student. Jessica had continued covering the story, documenting the implementation of the training program and interviewing passengers, airline employees, and civil rights advocates about the importance of addressing unconscious bias. Her work had won recognition from her school and had been featured in several major publications. She called Marcus one afternoon, excited to share news. Mr. Williams, I wanted to let you know that my series of articles about your experience and the airline's response has been nominated for a journalism award. But more importantly, I've been hearing from readers all over the country who say the story inspired them to examine their own biases and have difficult conversations in their workplaces and communities. That's wonderful. Jessica, Marcus said warmly, I'm glad the story is having a positive impact. I also wanted to ask your permission for something, Jessica continued. I've been approached by a publisher about turning the series into a book. It would be a deeper exploration of unconscious bias, discrimination, and constructive approaches to creating change. Would you be willing to be interviewed for the book? Marcus thought about it for a moment. His instinct was always to protect his privacy, but he also recognized the potential value of sharing his experience more broadly. Yes, I'm willing. But on one condition, the book has to include voices from many different people who've experienced discrimination, not just mine. I don't want this to be the story of a rich man who was wronged. I want it to be a story about systemic problems and systemic solutions. I completely agree, Jessica said. That's exactly my vision for it. 6 months after the incident on the plane, Marcus received an invitation to speak at an aviation industry conference. The topic was diversity, inclusion, and customer service. He accepted the invitation, seeing it as an opportunity to address industry leaders directly. Standing on the stage in front of hundreds of airline executives, managers, and employees, Marcus told his story. He didn't focus on the discrimination itself, but on what came after. The choice to respond with education rather than punishment, the commitment to systemic change, and the results that were already becoming visible. Today, that airline has trained over 15,000 employees in unconscious bias awareness, Marcus told the audience. Reports of discrimination complaints have decreased by 40%. Customer satisfaction scores have increased, particularly among passengers of color, and perhaps most importantly, employees report feeling better equipped to recognize and address their own biases. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. Angela Porter, the diversity trainer, had appeared at the edge of the galley. I couldn't help but overhear, she said apologetically. Mr. Williams, what you're suggesting is exactly the right approach. Punitive measures might feel satisfying in the moment, but they don't create lasting change. Education and understanding do. Robert Jefferson had also approached, moving slowly with his cane. In 40 years of civil rights law, I learned that the best outcomes happen when people are willing to have difficult conversations and do the hard work of examining their biases. What you're offering these flight attendants is a real gift, the opportunity to become better people and help others do the same. Sarah looked overwhelmed. I don't deserve this kind of grace, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I promise you I will take this seriously. I will do the work. And I will spend the rest of my career making sure other people don't make the same mistakes I did. That's all I ask, Marcus said. He turned to James. I'd like you to participate in the training too, if you're willing. You made a mistake today by not investigating properly, by automatically siding with Sarah without considering that she might be wrong. That's also a form of bias that needs to be addressed. James nodded firmly. Absolutely. I'm committed to doing better, and I'm going to recommend to our airline that this kind of training becomes mandatory for all crew members, not just us. David Chen spoke up from where he was standing nearby. Mr. Williams, if you don't mind, I'd like to help support this initiative. I have connections with several airlines through my investment portfolio. I'd be happy to facilitate conversations about implementing comprehensive bias training across the industry. I'd appreciate that, Marcus said. The more airlines we can reach, the better. Jessica, the journalism student, was still holding her phone. Mr. Williams, I recorded some of what just happened. Would you be okay with me sharing this? I think people need to see not just the discrimination, but also your response to it. It's a powerful example of how to create real change. Marcus considered it carefully. He still valued his privacy, but he also recognized the potential impact of sharing this story. You can share it, but I have one condition. Don't make me the focus. Make the message the focus. This isn't about me being a billionaire who was wronged. This is about the fact that discrimination still happens every day, and about how we can address it constructively instead of just getting angry and moving on. I can do that, Jessica agreed. Thank you for trusting me with this. The elderly woman who had been kind to Marcus earlier made her way to the galley area. Young man, I just want to say that what you're doing here is remarkable. I've seen a lot of anger and division in my lifetime, but I've seen very little of what you're demonstrating right now. True wisdom and compassion combined with a commitment to change. You're an inspiration. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. He wasn't used to being praised for simply trying to do the right thing. Thank you, he managed to say. I just hope it makes a difference. Sarah reached out hesitantly, as if wanting to shake Marcus's hand but unsure if she had the right. Marcus saw her gesture and extended his hand first. Sarah took it gratefully, her eyes filling with tears again. Thank you, she said. I know I don't deserve your kindness, but I promise I won't waste this opportunity. I'm going to learn everything I can, and I'm going to work every day to be better. That's all any of us can do, Marcus replied. The captain's voice came over the speaker system again. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into London. Please return to your seats and make sure your seat belts are fastened. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for landing. The announcement seemed to break the spell that had fallen over the first-class cabin. Passengers began settling back into their seats, stowing their belongings and adjusting their seat backs to the upright position. But Marcus could see that something had changed. People were still talking quietly about what they'd witnessed, but the conversation seemed thoughtful rather than angry. Marcus returned to his seat and buckled his seatbelt. Through the window, he could see the lights of London appearing below as they descended through the clouds. The city looked beautiful from up here, sprawling and bright against the dark landscape. Robert Jefferson leaned across the aisle one more time. Mr. Williams, I hope you'll keep in touch. I'd like to stay informed about how the training program goes. I have a feeling this is going to become an important case study in how to address discrimination effectively. I'd be happy to keep you updated, Marcus said. He pulled out his phone and exchanged contact information with Robert, as well as with Angela, David, and Jessica. In a strange way, this difficult experience had connected him with people who shared his values and his commitment to making the world a better place. Sarah came through the cabin one final time, checking that everyone was prepared for landing. When she reached Marcus's row, she paused. Mr. Williams, she said quietly, I just want you to know that you've changed my life today. I will never forget this, and I will never stop working to become the kind of person who treats everyone with equal respect and dignity. Marcus looked up at her and saw genuine transformation beginning in her eyes. I believe you, he said, and I look forward to hearing about the positive impact you'll have on others. As the plane touched down on the runway in London, Marcus felt a complex mixture of emotions. He was still tired from the confrontation, still hurt by the discrimination he'd experienced. But he also felt something he hadn't expected: hope. Real, tangible hope that this incident might actually lead to meaningful change. The plane taxied to the gate, and passengers began gathering their belongings. Marcus collected his laptop and carry-on bag, preparing to exit the aircraft. As he stood up, several passengers approached him to shake his hand or express their support. Thank you for speaking up, one man said. You handled that with such grace, a woman told him. I learned something important today. another passenger added. Marcus accepted their kind words, feeling grateful that so many people had witnessed what happened and understood its significance. As he walked toward the exit, he saw Sarah and James standing near the door, saying goodbye to passengers as they departed. When Marcus reached them, Sarah spoke softly. "Have a safe trip, Mr. Williams, and thank you again for everything." Marcus nodded. "Take care of yourself. And remember, this is just the beginning of the work. The real challenge is sustaining the commitment over time." "I understand," Sarah said. "I won't let you down." As Marcus stepped off the plane and into the jet bridge, he felt the weight of the experience begin to lift slightly from his shoulders. He still had a business meeting to attend, a presentation to give, a company to run. But he also had a new mission: to make sure that the training program he'd offered to Sarah and James became a model for real change in the airline industry and beyond. Sometimes the hardest experiences led to the most important opportunities. Marcus was determined to make sure this was one of those times. 3 weeks had passed since that memorable flight to London. Marcus sat in his office on the 20th floor of his company headquarters in San Francisco, looking out at the city skyline. His desk was covered with papers, reports, and his laptop showing multiple spreadsheets, but his mind kept drifting back to that day on the plane. The incident had spread far beyond what he'd expected. Jessica, the journalism student, had shared her video on social media with the caption Marcus had requested, focusing not on his wealth or status, but on the message about discrimination and constructive change. Within 48 hours, it had been viewed millions of times. News outlets had picked up the story. But unlike many viral incidents of discrimination, this one had a different narrative. Instead of focusing on outrage and calls for punishment, the media coverage highlighted Marcus's response, his offer of education rather than retribution, his emphasis on systemic change rather than individual blame. His phone buzzed with a text message from Angela Porter, the diversity trainer he'd met on the flight. "Just finished the first session with Sarah and James. They're doing excellent work. You should be proud of what you started." Marcus smiled and typed back a quick response. "Thank you for facilitating. Keep me posted on their progress." The training program had begun immediately after Marcus returned from London. He had personally met with Sarah and James via video call to discuss the curriculum and ensure they understood the commitment they were making. Both had shown genuine eagerness to learn and grow from their mistakes, but the impact had spread far beyond just those two flight attendants. The airline's CEO had reached out to Marcus 3 days after the incident, personally apologizing and asking for a meeting. Marcus had agreed, and that meeting had led to something much bigger than he'd anticipated. There was a knock on his office door. "Come in," Marcus called. His assistant Jennifer poked her head in. "Mr. Williams, the airline executives are here for your 2 o'clock meeting. Should I show them to the conference room?" "Yes, please, I'll be there in just a moment." Marcus stood up and straightened his tie. Today's meeting was important. The airline had flown several executives out to San Francisco specifically to discuss implementing a comprehensive bias training program for all their employees. David Chen, still standing nearby, joined the conversation. "This is exactly why diversity training is so important in business. I require all the companies in my investment portfolio to provide it for their employees. But airline training clearly needs improvement." Marcus listened to all of them, feeling both supported and overwhelmed. These were intelligent, accomplished people, and they all understood what had happened. But he still felt the weight of being at the center of this incident, of having his quiet flight disrupted by discrimination. A young woman approached, holding her phone nervously. She looked to be in her 20s, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater. "Mr. Williams, I'm sorry to interrupt. My name is Jessica, and I'm a journalism student. I was recording some of what happened because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I wanted to ask your permission before I do anything with the footage." Marcus appreciated her asking. "What were you planning to do with it?" "Well," Jessica said carefully, "I think this is an important story. It shows that discrimination is still very real, even in spaces where you wouldn't expect it. But I know it's your story, not mine. If you don't want me to share it, I'll delete the video right now." Marcus thought about it for a moment. Part of him wanted to keep everything private, to handle it quietly and move on with his life. But another part recognized that Robert and Angela were right. This could be a teaching moment, an opportunity to help people understand how discrimination still happens every day. "Before I answer," Marcus said, "I'd like to talk to the flight attendants." "Would that be possible?" Jessica nodded and stepped back. Marcus stood up and looked toward the galley where James and Sarah were huddled together, talking in low voices. He walked toward them, aware that every eye in the cabin was following him. "Excuse me," Marcus said when he reached them. "Could I speak with both of you privately? Perhaps in the galley?" James and Sarah exchanged uncertain glances, but they nodded. The galley was small, barely big enough for 3 people, but they managed to squeeze in. Sarah's eyes were red from crying, and she couldn't seem to look directly at Marcus. "I want to understand something," Marcus said gently. "Sarah, when you looked at me today, what did you see?" Sarah finally met his eyes, her own filling with tears again. "I'm so ashamed," she whispered. "When you first boarded, I saw a young black man in casual clothes. And I'm ashamed to admit that I assumed, I don't even know what I assumed exactly. Maybe that you were upgrading from economy or using points, or that someone had bought your ticket. I never thought about why I was making those assumptions. I just did. And when I asked for the expensive wine," Marcus prompted. "I panicked," Sarah admitted. "I thought you were trying to take advantage, trying to get something fancy that you couldn't afford." "God, I can't believe I'm saying this out loud. It sounds so horrible." "It is horrible," Marcus agreed, but his tone wasn't cruel. "But at least you're being honest about it now." "That's a start." James spoke up, his voice heavy with regret. "I failed too, Mr. Williams. When Sarah came to me, I should have investigated properly. Instead, I automatically believed her version of events because she's my colleague and I trust her. I didn't even consider that she might be wrong or that there might be another explanation for what was happening." "Why do you think that was?" Marcus asked. James struggled with the question. I guess I didn't want to believe that one of my crew members would discriminate against a passenger. It was easier to think you were the problem than to accept that we were." Marcus nodded slowly. This was the kind of honest conversation that rarely happened. The kind where people actually admitted their biases and mistakes instead of making excuses. "Here's what I want you both to understand," Marcus said. "This doesn't just happen to me because I'm a billionaire who can fight back. It happens to thousands of black people every single day. It happens to the person who can't afford first class, who doesn't have a fancy title, who doesn't have other passengers willing to stand up for them. Those people just have to accept the discrimination and move on because they don't have any power to change it." Sarah was crying again, but this time it seemed like tears of genuine understanding, rather than just embarrassment. "I'm so sorry," she said. "Not just to you, but to everyone I've probably treated differently without even realizing it. How do I fix this? How do I make sure I never do this again?" Marcus looked at her thoughtfully. An idea was forming in his mind. Something that might actually create real change instead of just being another apology that led nowhere. Marcus stood in the small galley with Sarah and James, feeling the weight of the moment. He could see genuine remorse in their faces, but he had seen remorse before. What mattered was whether that remorse would lead to actual change or if it would fade away as soon as the discomfort of this moment passed. "I want to tell you both something," Marcus began, his voice steady and calm. "I grew up in a small town in Alabama. My father worked in a factory and my mother cleaned houses. We didn't have much money, but my parents taught me to work hard and believe in myself. They also taught me something else. They taught me that most people aren't intentionally cruel. Most discrimination comes from ignorance and unconscious bias, not from hatred." Sarah wiped her eyes, listening intently. James stood with his arms crossed, his expression troubled. "When I was 12 years old," Marcus continued, "I went into a store to buy a birthday present for my mother. I had been saving my allowance for months. The store owner followed me around the entire time, watching everything I touched. When I tried to pay for a scarf I'd picked out, she examined my money carefully, holding it up to the light to make sure it wasn't fake. Then she asked me where I'd gotten the money. I was just a kid trying to buy a present for my mom, but she saw me as a potential thief." Sarah made a small sound of distress. Marcus could see that his story was having an impact. "That was one of the first times I really understood that people would judge me differently because of my skin color," Marcus said. "It hurt then, and honestly it still hurts now when it happens. You never get used to it. You just learn to live with it." "I can't imagine," James said quietly. I'm sorry you've had to experience that throughout your life. Marcus nodded his acknowledgement. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand something important. When you discriminated against me today, you weren't just refusing me a glass of wine. You were adding to decades of experiences that have told me I don't belong in certain spaces, that I need to prove myself constantly, that I'm not good enough just as I am. I never thought about it that way, Sarah said, her voice breaking. I just thought it was one incident, one mistake. I didn't realize it was part of a larger pattern. That's exactly the problem, Marcus explained. Every person who discriminates thinks their actions are isolated, just one small thing. But when you're on the receiving end, it's not one small thing. It's 1,000 small things building up over a lifetime. The three of them stood in silence for a moment. Through the galley curtain, Marcus could see the other passengers watching, waiting to see what would happen next. He thought about all the people who had spoken up, who had shared their own experiences, who had made it clear they understood what had happened. Then Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself. I don't want you to be fired, he said to Sarah and James. They both looked shocked. Sarah's mouth fell open. What? But After what I did, let me finish, Marcus held up his hand. I don't want you fired because I don't think punishment alone teaches anything. People lose their jobs, everyone feels better for a moment, but nothing actually changes. The next person makes the same mistake because they never learned why it was wrong. Then what do you want? James asked, seeming genuinely confused. Marcus had been thinking about this throughout the conversation. I run a foundation through my company. We focus on education and creating opportunities for underserved communities. One of our programs is about unconscious bias and diversity training. It's not just lecture and theory. It's real conversations with people from different backgrounds, exercises that help you recognize your own biases, and ongoing support to change the way you think. He looked directly at Sarah. I want you to go through that program. Really commit to it, not just sit through it to check a box. I want you to learn why you made the assumptions you did, and how to recognize those patterns in yourself. And then I want you to help train other flight attendants so this doesn't keep happening. Sarah's eyes widened. You would do that? After what I did to you? I'm not doing it for you, Marcus said honestly. I'm doing it because I'm tired of having these same experiences over and over again. I'm tired of seeing other people go through it. If I can use this situation to actually create change, then at least something good comes from a bad experience. James shook his head in amazement. Mr. Williams, I have to say this is incredibly generous. Most people in your position would file a complaint and push for us to be terminated. You'd be well within your rights to do that. Maybe, Marcus agreed. But I've learned something from building my company. The best results don't come from punishing people for their mistakes. They come from helping people understand their mistakes and grow from them. That's what I want to do here. You assumed I couldn't afford expensive wine. You assumed I was trying to get something I didn't deserve. Sarah was crying openly now. I'm so sorry, she sobbed. You're right. I know it's not an excuse, but I didn't even realize I was doing it. I thought I was just following policies, but now I see that I was treating you differently, and it was because of your race. I'm so sorry. James put a hand on Sarah's shoulder, looking deeply uncomfortable. Perhaps we should continue this conversation in private, he suggested quietly. But Marcus wasn't done. He had been silent too many times before, had let things go to avoid making scenes. But this time felt different. All these people had witnessed what happened. They had seen the discrimination with their own eyes. Maybe this was an opportunity to actually change something. I don't want a private conversation, Marcus said. I think everyone here deserves to hear this because everyone here saw what happened. They need to understand that this kind of discrimination happens every day, in big ways and small ways, to people who don't have millions of dollars or famous names. What happens to those people? Do they just accept being treated poorly because they don't have anyone to speak up for them? The cabin was completely silent except for Sarah's quiet crying. Every passenger was watching, many of them looking uncomfortable but unable to look away. Marcus continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I've experienced this my entire life. Being followed around in stores, being stopped by police for no reason, being questioned about whether I really live in my own neighborhood, having people assume I'm dangerous or lazy or trying to cheat the system, and every single time I have to decide whether to speak up or stay silent. If I speak up, people say I'm being too sensitive or playing the race card. If I stay silent, nothing changes. An elderly gentleman a few rows back stood up slowly. He had tears in his eyes, too. "Young man," he said in a voice thick with emotion, "I'm a retired civil rights lawyer. I spent 40 years fighting discrimination cases. And I want you to know that what you just said is the most important thing anyone on this plane will hear today. You're absolutely right. This needs to be talked about, not hidden away." Another passenger, a middle-aged black woman, also stood up. "I just want to say thank you," she told Marcus. "Thank you for speaking up. I've experienced the exact same things you described, and I usually stay quiet because I'm afraid of being labeled as difficult or angry. But you're right. Staying quiet doesn't help anyone." Marcus nodded at them both, feeling a complex mix of emotions. He was exhausted from the confrontation, angry at what had happened, and sad that this was still such a common experience in the modern world. But he also felt something else, something that might have been hope. These people understood. They had witnessed the truth with their own eyes, and maybe that would make a difference. The atmosphere in the cabin had completely changed. What had started as a quiet, routine flight had become something much more significant. Passengers who had been strangers an hour ago were now connected by this shared experience of witnessing discrimination and hearing Marcus speak his truth. James looked overwhelmed, his face pale and his hands still trembling slightly. Sarah had stopped crying but looked devastated, standing in the aisle with her arms wrapped around herself. Marcus could see that she was genuinely shaken, but he still wasn't sure if she truly understood the deeper problem, or if she was just upset about being caught. The businessman who had first spoken up walked down the aisle toward Marcus. He extended his hand. "Mr. Williams, my name is David Chen. I'm a venture capitalist based in San Francisco. I actually tried to invest in your company about 5 years ago, but you weren't taking outside investment at the time." Marcus shook his hand, managing a small smile. "I remember that proposal. You had some interesting ideas, but I wasn't ready to give up any control of the company back then." David nodded. "I understood your decision, and frankly, you've proven that you didn't need investors like me. You've built something extraordinary." He paused, glancing at Sarah and James. "I'm sorry I revealed your identity like that. I know you probably prefer to keep a low profile. But I was so angry at what I was seeing, and I felt like they needed to understand the gravity of their mistake." "I appreciate the support," Marcus said honestly. "But you're right that I prefer privacy. The thing is, my identity shouldn't matter. Whether I'm a billionaire or a teacher or a construction worker, I should receive the same treatment as every other passenger in first class." "Absolutely right," David agreed. "But unfortunately, we live in a world where sometimes people need to see proof of success before they'll admit they were wrong. It's a sad reality." The elderly gentleman who had identified himself as a retired civil rights lawyer also approached. He moved slowly, using a cane, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "Mr. Williams, my name is Robert Jefferson. I wonder if I might have a word with you. I have some experience with these kinds of situations, and I'd like to offer some advice if you're willing to hear it." Marcus nodded and gestured to the empty seat beside him. "Please, sit down." Robert settled into the seat with a grateful sigh. "These seats are much more comfortable than the one I had back in economy. My grandson bought me this ticket as a gift, but I suppose they ran out of first-class seats by the time he booked." He smiled warmly at Marcus. "Now I couldn't help but overhear everything that happened, and I want to tell you something important. What you did just now, speaking up and explaining the real issue, that took tremendous courage." "It didn't feel courageous," Marcus admitted. "It felt exhausting." "I know," Robert said with understanding in his voice. "Fighting discrimination is always exhausting because you're not just fighting one person or one incident. You're fighting against centuries of bias and prejudice that have been built into the way people think. But every time someone speaks up, it makes a difference. You've made a difference today." Marcus wanted to believe that, but he wasn't sure. "I've spoken up before, and things don't usually change. People apologize in the moment, but then everything goes back to the way it was." Robert leaned closer, his voice becoming more serious. "That's often true, but this situation is different for one important reason. You have witnesses. Every person in this cabin saw what happened. Many of them are probably recording this conversation on their phones right now." Marcus glanced around and realized Robert was right. Several passengers had their phones out, though they were trying to be discreet about it. In the age of social media, nothing stayed private for long. "That's what I was afraid of," Marcus said quietly. I don't want to become a viral video or a social media story. I just wanted to take a flight to London for a business meeting. I understand, Robert said, but you can't control what other people do with their phones. What you can control is how you handle this situation moving forward. You have an opportunity here to turn a negative experience into something positive. Before Marcus could respond, the captain's voice came over the speaker system. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Richard speaking. I've been informed that there's been an incident in the first-class cabin. I want to assure all passengers that we take any kind of discrimination or mistreatment very seriously. Once we land in London, there will be a full investigation into what occurred on this flight. In the meantime, I ask that everyone remain calm and respectful. Thank you. The announcement created another wave of murmuring throughout the cabin. Marcus was surprised that word had reached the captain. But then he realized that with so many people talking about it, of course, the news would spread quickly. Sarah was still standing in the aisle, now looking even more frightened. James had moved back toward the galley, probably to communicate with the captain. The cabin crew's worst fear was probably coming true, an incident serious enough that corporate headquarters would get involved. The middle-aged black woman who had spoken up earlier approached Marcus as well. She looked professional, dressed in a business suit with her hair in neat braids. Mr. Williams, I hope you don't mind me joining this conversation. My name is Angela Porter. I'm a corporate diversity trainer based in Chicago. Please, Marcus said, gesturing for her to come closer. Angela crouched in the aisle next to his seat. I train companies on unconscious bias and discrimination. What happened to you today is a textbook example of what I teach about. That flight attendant probably doesn't think of herself as racist. She probably has black friends or colleagues, but she still treated you differently because of unconscious biases she's never examined. I got that impression, Marcus agreed. She seemed genuinely shocked when she realized what she had done. That's very common, Angela explained. Most discrimination today isn't the obvious, hateful kind. It's subtle and unconscious. People make quick judgments based on stereotypes they've absorbed from society without even realizing it. The woman probably saw a black man in first class and her unconscious mind said, something doesn't fit here. So she created reasons to treat you differently. Robert nodded thoughtfully. That's an excellent point. In my day, we were fighting against explicit segregation and laws that openly discriminated. Today's civil rights battles are often against these unconscious biases that are harder to see and prove. Marcus stared out at the clouds, his jaw tight with frustration. Around him, the other passengers slowly returned to their activities, though several of them kept glancing in his direction with expressions of sympathy or outrage. Marcus picked up his phone and opened his notes app. He began writing down exactly what had happened, including the time, the flight number, and the names of the flight attendants. He wasn't sure what he would do with the information yet, but he wanted to have a record. As he wrote, he thought about all the times he had stayed silent when faced with discrimination, all the times he had let things go to avoid making waves. He wondered if staying silent had been the right choice, or if it had just allowed the problem to continue for others who came after him. The tension in the first-class cabin remained thick, even after James and Sarah returned to the galley. Marcus continued looking out the window, trying to focus on the endless sky outside, but his mind kept replaying the conversation. He had handled himself well, staying calm and respectful, but it didn't make the experience any less painful. Around him, the other passengers pretended to return to their activities, but Marcus could feel their eyes on him. Some looked sympathetic. Others seemed uncomfortable, probably wishing they could forget what they had witnessed. A few appeared angry on his behalf, but nobody said anything more. That was usually how it went. People might see injustice, but few wanted to get involved. Sarah began the dinner service about 30 minutes later. She pushed a cart through the cabin, her professional smile firmly back in place. She started at the front row, serving each passenger with careful attention. When she reached Marcus's row, her smile faded just slightly, but she maintained a polite tone. "Dinner service, sir," she said without looking directly at him. "We have beef tenderloin with roasted vegetables or pan-seared salmon with lemon butter sauce." "Which would you prefer?" "The beef, please," Marcus replied quietly. Sarah placed a tray on his fold-down table without ceremony. The presentation was neat, but Marcus noticed she didn't explain the meal or offer him the fresh ground pepper and sea salt that she had offered to other passengers. She simply set down the tray and moved on. Marcus looked at his meal. It actually looked delicious with the beef cooked to a perfect medium rare and the vegetables arranged artfully around it. But his appetite had disappeared. He picked at the food, eating a few bites so as not to waste it, but mostly just moving things around on his plate. An elderly woman in the row across from him caught his attention. She had white hair and kind eyes, and she had been watching the entire situation unfold. She leaned across the aisle toward Marcus, keeping her voice low so only he could hear. "Young man," she said gently, "I want you to know that what happened to you was wrong, completely wrong. I'm sorry you had to experience that." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat at her kindness. "Thank you," he managed to say. "I appreciate that. I've lived a long time," the woman continued, "and I've seen this kind of thing happen too many times. It's shameful that it's still happening in this day and age. If there's anything I can do to help, any statement I can make, or any person I can talk to, you just let me know." Marcus nodded, genuinely touched by her offer. "That's very kind of you. Thank you." The woman smiled sadly and returned to her own meal, but Marcus felt a little better knowing that at least some people understood what had really happened. After dinner, Sarah collected the trays. Most passengers had finished eating, and the cabin was settling into the quiet phase of the long flight. Some people were watching movies on their screens. Others had reclined their seats and were trying to sleep. The lights had been dimmed to create a more restful atmosphere. Marcus decided to try to work again. He opened his laptop and pulled up his presentation, but he found it hard to concentrate. His mind kept drifting back to Sarah's words, the way she had implied he was being difficult, the way James had supported her without even investigating the situation properly. He had built a billion-dollar company. He had been featured in major business magazines. He had given speeches at conferences around the world. He employed over 3,000 people and had helped countless small businesses succeed. But none of that mattered to Sarah. She had looked at him and made a judgment based purely on his appearance, on the color of his skin. Marcus was so lost in thought that he didn't notice the commotion at first. But gradually he became aware of raised voices coming from somewhere behind him. He turned to look and saw a man standing in the aisle, holding a phone and speaking to James. The man was in his 50s, wearing an expensive suit and designer glasses. He had been sitting several rows back, and Marcus vaguely remembered seeing him during boarding. Now the man looked agitated, gesturing toward Marcus and then at his phone. "Excuse me," the man was saying loudly enough for everyone to hear. "But do you have any idea who you just treated so disrespectfully? Do you know who that man is?" James looked confused and irritated. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice and return to your seat. That situation has been handled." "Handled?" the man repeated incredulously. "You didn't handle anything. You took the side of your crew member without even investigating what really happened. And in the process, you discriminated against one of the most successful entrepreneurs in America." Several passengers were fully awake now, turning in their seats to see what was happening. Sarah had emerged from the galley, her face pale. The businessman held up his phone. "This is Marcus Williams. He was on the cover of Forbes magazine 3 months ago. He's the founder and CEO of Connect Core Technologies. His company is worth over $2 billion. He's donated millions to educational programs and charitable causes. And you just treated him like he was trying to steal something from your airplane." Marcus felt his heart sink. He hadn't wanted this. He never wanted people to know who he was or how much money he had. He wanted to be treated fairly because he was a human being, not because he was wealthy or famous. James's face had gone completely white. He looked at Marcus with wide eyes, then back at the businessman, then at Sarah. I didn't know," he stammered. "You shouldn't have needed to know," the businessman said firmly. "Every passenger deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of who they are or what they look like. But since you clearly need proof that this man deserves a $300 bottle of wine, there it is. He could probably buy this entire airplane if he wanted to." Another passenger spoke up, a younger woman who had been typing on her laptop. "I know him too. I saw him give a keynote speech at a tech conference last year. He talked about diversity in the technology industry and how important it is to give everyone equal opportunities. This is absolutely unacceptable." More murmurs rippled through the cabin. Several passengers were now looking up Marcus on their phones, finding articles and photos that confirmed his identity. Marcus closed his eyes, wishing he could disappear. This was his nightmare scenario. having his privacy invaded and his wealth put on display. Sarah stood frozen in the aisle, her face bright red. She looked like she wanted to sink into the floor. James seemed to be struggling to find words, opening and closing his mouth several times without speaking. Finally, James approached Marcus's seat, his hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Williams," he said, his voice shaking, "I sincerely apologize. I had no idea who you were. If I had known," Marcus held up his hand, cutting him off. "Please don't," he said quietly but firmly. "Don't apologize because of who I am or how much money I have. That's not the point. The point is that every person on this plane deserves to be treated with basic respect and dignity." "Of course," James said quickly. "You're absolutely right. I apologize regardless of who you are. What happened was wrong, and I should have investigated properly instead of just assuming Sarah was correct." Sarah had tears in her eyes now. She took a hesitant step forward, wringing her hands. "Mr. Williams, I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry. I made a terrible mistake." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. He could see genuine distress in her face, but he wasn't sure if she was sorry for what she had done or just sorry that she had been caught treating a wealthy person badly. "There was a difference. Can I ask you a question?" Marcus said to Sarah. His voice was calm, but there was steel underneath it. "If I wasn't a billionaire, if I was just a regular person working a normal job, would you still think what you did was wrong?" Sarah opened her mouth, then closed it again. She seemed to be struggling with how to answer. The entire cabin was silent, waiting to hear what she would say. Yes, Sarah finally said, though she didn't sound entirely convincing. "Yes, I would still think it was wrong. I shouldn't have refused to serve you that wine. I shouldn't have spoken to you the way I did. I'm sorry." Marcus studied her face, trying to determine if she meant it. "Do you understand why you treated me differently?" he asked. "Can you put into words what made you decide I didn't deserve the same service as everyone else?" Sarah's tears spilled over now, running down her cheeks. "I don't know," she whispered. "I guess I made assumptions. Wrong assumptions. Based on—" She trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. "Based on my race," Marcus finished for her. "You looked at me, a black man in first class, and you assumed I didn't belong here." The plane reached its cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign turned off with a soft chime. Sarah and another flight attendant named James began preparing the meal service in the small galley at the front of the cabin. Marcus could hear them moving carts and talking quietly to each other. For the past 3 hours, Marcus had been working on his laptop, reviewing his presentation and answering emails. His meeting in London was important, and he wanted everything to be perfect. But his eyes were getting tired from staring at the screen, and he decided to take a break. He looked at the menu card again, reading through the wine selections. One wine caught his attention, a French red wine from Bordeaux. Marcus didn't know much about wine, but he remembered a friend telling him that Bordeaux wines were special. The menu described it as having rich flavors of blackberry and oak, perfect for the beef dish that would be served for dinner. Marcus pressed the call button above his seat. A soft light came on, letting the flight attendants know someone needed assistance. He waited patiently, looking out the window at the clouds below. They looked like thick cotton, stretching endlessly in every direction. Sarah appeared a minute later, looking slightly annoyed at being interrupted. "Yes?" she asked, her voice lacking any warmth. "Hello," Marcus said with a friendly smile. "I was looking at the wine menu, and I'd like to try the Bordeaux that's listed here." He pointed to the description on the card. "The Chateau Margaux, if that's available." Sarah's expression changed immediately. Her eyes narrowed slightly and she crossed her arms. "That wine is reserved for our premium passengers," she said firmly. Marcus was confused. "I'm sorry, but I am in first class. Isn't that a premium seat?" "The wine you're asking for is very expensive," Sarah replied, her tone becoming defensive. "It's for passengers who specifically request our premium service package." "I didn't know there was a premium service package," Marcus said calmly. "The wine is listed on the menu that was in my seat pocket. I assumed everything on the menu was available to first-class passengers." Sarah shook her head. "That particular wine isn't available for you. I can offer you something else. We have a nice Merlot from California that would be suitable." Marcus felt a familiar discomfort growing in his chest. He had heard that tone before, that subtle suggestion that he should be grateful for whatever was offered and not ask for more. But he remained calm and polite. Could you check with the head flight attendant? The wine is on the menu, and I don't see anything about a special package. I don't need to check with anyone, Sarah said, her voice rising slightly. I'm telling you that the wine isn't available. If you don't want the Merlot, I can bring you something from our standard selection. The woman across the aisle had stopped reading her magazine and was now watching the conversation with interest. The two businessmen behind Marcus had also grown quiet, listening to what was happening. Marcus kept his voice steady and respectful. I understand you're busy, but I would really appreciate it if you could check. I saw that wine being served to other passengers earlier during the meal service. This was true. About an hour ago, Marcus had seen Sarah pour wine from a distinctive bottle with a cream-colored label for the businessmen behind him. He had recognized it as the same Chateau Margaux from the menu because the label was clearly visible. Sarah's face flushed red. You must be mistaken, she said quickly. That was a different wine, and I really think you should just accept what's being offered instead of making a fuss about this. I'm not trying to make a fuss, Marcus replied quietly. I'm simply asking for something that's on the menu. If it's truly not available, that's fine, but I'd like an explanation of why it's listed if passengers can't order it. The woman across the aisle suddenly spoke up. Excuse me, but I saw you serve that exact wine earlier. The bottle with the cream label. You poured it for the gentleman in row 3. Sarah turned toward the woman, looking flustered. I'm sorry, ma'am, but I think you're confused about what you saw. I'm not confused at all, the woman said firmly. I was admiring the label because my husband and I visited that vineyard last year. I recognized it immediately. One of the businessmen behind Marcus also spoke up. She did serve us that wine. We specifically asked for the Chateau Margaux, and she brought it without any questions. I don't understand why there's a problem now. Sarah's face turned an even deeper shade of red. She looked around the cabin, realizing that several passengers were now watching the situation unfold. Perhaps there was some confusion earlier, she said, her voice tight. But as I've explained, that wine is meant for certain passengers, and I'm following company policy. Marcus leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. He had experienced discrimination many times in his life, but it never got easier. The subtle insults, the different treatment, the way people made assumptions based on the color of his skin. It all hurt just as much as it did when he was younger. But he had also learned that responding with anger rarely solved anything. I would like to speak with a supervisor, Marcus said calmly. Not because I want to cause trouble, but because I think there's been a misunderstanding about company policy, and I'd like to clarify it. Sarah's jaw tightened. Fine, she said sharply. I'll get the flight supervisor. But I'm telling you right now that he's going to say the same thing I'm saying. She turned and walked quickly toward the galley, her shoulders stiff with anger. The cabin was completely silent now. Every passenger in first class was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The woman across the aisle caught Marcus's eye and gave him a sympathetic look. I'm sorry you're dealing with this, she said softly. This isn't right. Marcus nodded his thanks but didn't say anything. He could feel the familiar weight of exhaustion that came from having to constantly prove himself, constantly explain that he deserved the same treatment as everyone else. It was tiring in a way that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. A few minutes later, Sarah returned with James, the other flight attendant. James was a tall man in his late 40s with graying hair and a professional demeanor. He approached Marcus's seat with a neutral expression. Good afternoon, sir, James said politely. I understand there's some confusion about our wine service. Can you explain the situation to me? Marcus explained everything calmly and clearly. He mentioned the wine on the menu, Sarah's refusal to serve it, and the fact that other passengers had received that same wine without any questions or mention of a special package. As Marcus spoke, Sarah stood behind James with her arms crossed, occasionally shaking her head or making small sounds of disagreement. When Marcus finished, she immediately jumped in. Sir, with all due respect, this passenger is being very difficult, Sarah said to James. He's demanding a wine that costs over $300 per bottle. He seems to think he's entitled to special treatment, and when I tried to offer him reasonable alternatives, he refused to accept them. Now he's making a scene and disturbing the other passengers. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Sarah was completely misrepresenting what had happened, making him sound unreasonable and demanding when he had been nothing but polite. Worse, she was using language that he knew played into certain stereotypes, calling him difficult and suggesting he wanted special treatment. James looked uncomfortable. He glanced between Marcus and Sarah, clearly trying to decide who to believe. "Sir," he said to Marcus, "I'm sure you understand that we have to manage our resources carefully on these flights. Sometimes we reserve certain items for specific situations. I'm certain that Sarah here was just trying to follow our guidelines." "But the wine is on the menu," Marcus repeated, his patience beginning to wear thin, and other passengers received it without any questions. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for the same treatment that everyone else received." James sighed. "I understand your frustration, sir, but I have to support my crew members. If Sarah says the wine isn't available, then I have to accept her judgment. She's been working these flights for over 10 years and she knows our policies very well." The woman across the aisle spoke up again, her voice sharp. "This is absolutely ridiculous. I saw her serve that wine to other passengers. So did everyone else in this cabin. Why are you acting like this man is lying?" James looked annoyed now. "Ma'am, I appreciate your input, but this is between me and this passenger. I would ask you to please stay out of it." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. He felt the familiar sting of injustice, but he forced himself to stay calm. Getting angry wouldn't help. It never did. People would just use his anger as proof that he was the problem, that he was the difficult one, that he was the person who didn't belong in first class. He opened his eyes and looked directly at James. "I don't want to cause any more disruption," he said quietly. "You can forget about the wine, but I want you to know that what happened here isn't right, and I think you know it too." James's expression flickered with something that might have been guilt or discomfort, but he quickly masked it with professional courtesy. "I apologize if you feel you weren't treated well, sir. Is there anything else I can get for you?" "No," Marcus said, turning back to the window. "Nothing else." James and Sarah walked back to the galley together, speaking in low voices. Marcus Williams walked through the airport terminal with his carry-on bag rolling behind him. He wore a simple black sweater and jeans, looking like any other traveler on a Tuesday afternoon. Nobody turned to stare at him. Nobody asked for his autograph. That was exactly how he liked it. At 42 years old, Marcus had built one of the most successful technology companies in America. His software helped millions of small businesses manage their work. The company was worth billions of dollars, and Marcus owned most of it. But he never wore fancy clothes or showed off his wealth. He believed in staying humble and living a normal life as much as possible. The gate area for Flight 447 to London was crowded with travelers. Some were business people in suits typing on their laptops. Others were families with young children, trying to keep them entertained before the long flight. Marcus found a quiet corner and sat down to check his emails on his phone. He had an important meeting in London the next day with potential investors who wanted to expand his company into Europe. When the boarding announcement came, Marcus waited patiently as the airline called different groups. He had a first-class ticket, which meant he could board early. He rarely flew first class, but this was a 9-hour flight, and he needed to arrive in London ready to work. His assistant had insisted on booking the expensive seat. As Marcus entered the plane, he immediately felt the difference between first class and the economy section he usually chose. The seats were wide and comfortable, covered in soft leather. Each passenger had plenty of space to stretch out. Small pillows and blankets were already waiting on every seat. The overhead compartments looked bigger too. A flight attendant stood near the entrance to the first-class cabin, greeting passengers with a bright smile. She looked to be in her mid-30s with blonde hair pulled back into a neat bun. Her name tag read Sarah Mitchell. She welcomed each passenger warmly, helping them find their seats and offering to store their bags. When Marcus approached, Sarah glanced at his boarding pass and gestured toward his seat without much enthusiasm. "Row 2, sir," she said quickly, then immediately turned her attention to the passenger behind him, an older white man in an expensive suit. Her smile returned as she chatted with him about the weather and asked if he traveled to London often. Marcus noticed the difference in her tone but said nothing. He had experienced this kind of treatment many times before. Sometimes people made quick judgments based on how someone looked. He had learned long ago not to let it bother him. He simply found his seat by the window and settled in. The first-class cabin had only 12 seats arranged in a 2x2 configuration. Marcus had seat 2A right by the window. Next to him in 2B was an empty seat. Across the aisle sat a well-dressed woman reading a fashion magazine. Behind him, two businessmen were already discussing their work in loud voices. Marcus stored his bag in the overhead compartment and sat down. The seat was incredibly comfortable. He found the button to recline it and tested how much it moved back. He could almost lie completely flat. There was a small screen in front of him with hundreds of movies and TV shows to choose from. A menu card in the seat pocket listed the meals that would be served during the flight. Sarah moved through the cabin, checking on each passenger. She stopped to chat with the woman across the aisle, complimenting her scarf and asking if she needed anything. She spent several minutes with the businessmen behind Marcus, laughing at their jokes and making recommendations from the wine list. When she reached Marcus's row, her demeanor changed again. "Would you like something to drink before takeoff?" she asked in a flat voice, not making eye contact. "Yes, please," Marcus replied politely. "Could I have some orange juice?" Sarah nodded and moved on without another word. She didn't ask if he wanted ice. She didn't tell him about the snacks that were available. She simply took his order and left. A few minutes later, she returned with the drinks. Marcus watched as she carefully placed crystal glasses on small napkins for the other passengers, taking time to make sure everything looked perfect. When she got to Marcus, she simply handed him a plastic cup of orange juice, the kind used in economy class. She didn't even put down a napkin first. Marcus looked at the plastic cup, then at the crystal glasses the other passengers had received. He took a slow breath and decided not to say anything. Maybe the flight attendant was just having a bad day. Maybe she was tired or stressed. He didn't want to assume the worst about people. Other passengers continued boarding the plane. The empty seat next to Marcus remained vacant, which meant he would have extra space during the flight. That was a small blessing. The economy section behind the curtain was filling up quickly, and he could hear children crying and parents trying to calm them down. Sarah made several more trips through the cabin, making sure everyone was comfortable. She brought extra pillows to some passengers without them even asking. She helped an elderly man adjust his seat. She chatted and smiled with everyone except Marcus. Each time she passed his row, she barely glanced in his direction. The captain's voice came over the speaker system, welcoming everyone aboard and explaining that they would be taking off in about 15 minutes. The flight time to London would be 8 hours and 45 minutes. The weather looked good, and they expected a smooth flight. Sarah began her safety demonstration, showing passengers how to use the seat belts, oxygen masks, and life vests. Marcus had seen this demonstration hundreds of times, but he always paid attention. Safety was important no matter how often you flew. After the demonstration, Sarah returned to her station at the front of the cabin. The plane began pushing back from the gate and the engines started their low rumble. Marcus looked out the window at the airport terminal growing smaller as they moved toward the runway. He thought about the meeting waiting for him in London. He had prepared his presentation carefully, running through the numbers and projections dozens of times. This European expansion could add millions of new customers to his platform. It could create hundreds of new jobs. It was the kind of opportunity that came along once in a lifetime. The plane turned onto the runway and paused for a moment. Then the engines roared louder and they began racing down the pavement. Marcus felt the familiar push back into his seat as the plane picked up speed. Within seconds, they lifted off the ground, climbing steeply into the afternoon sky. Marcus watched the ground fall away below him. The airport became tiny, then disappeared altogether as they rose through a layer of clouds. When they broke through into clear sky, the sun was shining brightly and he could see for miles in every direction. The flight to London had begun. Marcus settled back into his comfortable seat, closed his eyes for a moment and tried to relax. He had no idea that this flight would become one of the most important experiences of his life.